No? Okay, and now I'll introduce Cosmo. Dr. Grupp, or Cosmo as he is universally known, is a successful entrepreneur and inventor. He has a PhD in nanotechnology physics from the University of Pennsylvania, and he applies those skills to medical devices. He is 3 for 3 in inventions and has worked on startups that have come to market. While he was a visiting scholar at Stanford, he started a company whose transistor is now in the iPhone. He invented Procept biorobotics tissue resection method that is now used clinically for BPH with a near zero risk of nerve damage. Locally, he was the first employee and VP of research and development at Hemex Health, one of our startup companies. He developed Hemex's malaria diagnostic, which is now on the market in India and is poised to save millions of kids' lives. Currently, he runs GruppWorks, a medical device innovation consultancy, where he has spun off of Life Air, which has developed the first ventilator that eliminates the risk of patient-to-patient viral transmission. Cosmo has 2 sons still in grade school, who he helped develop and produce their first product for their own company, Two Brothers Toys, which has sold out at Oodles in Selwood. So welcome to you, Cosmo. We appreciate you being here today and giving this talk. So if you're ready, you can go ahead and share your screen, and I'll make you the spotlight video.
Thank you so much, Renee. I think before I share my screen, I'll just say hello to everybody. So I think my video goes away. Thank you so much for the introduction and making this happen. And thank you to everybody for being here. It's wonderful to at least meet you virtually. I see a lot of names on the list of people that I know. So the hardest part for all of us is not being able to say hello in person. So I'm giving everybody a big warm handshake or a hug. Now I'll share my screen. Let's see, go to here, share. All right. So today I'd like to tell you about a lot of the things I've learned in R&D over the years. And the title of my talk is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People in R&D, or How to Solve Big Problems Fast and Cheap. In my career, I've been lucky enough to have had 2 great mentors in this regard. One of them is my advisor from graduate school, and the other is the Wright Brothers. The Wright Brothers are arguably the most effective engineers in history who solved the biggest long-standing problem humanity had faced of how to fly. And they did it in a remarkably short amount of time for a remarkably small amount of money. So I asked myself, what is it about them that made them such a success? How did they do it? My first hypothesis is that, well, they were probably just geniuses. And my second hypothesis is that it was probably the motor, that it was the turn of the century and motors were a new thing. And it was probably sort of inevitable that someone would learn to fly now that you had a motor. It turns out that both of those were entirely wrong. So a lot of what I'm going to tell you today is really their story. So first, a little bit of history. Otto Lilienthal in Europe was one of the great pioneers of aviation, and he built 12 aircraft in 10 years. And the Wright brothers figured out that he had spent a total of about 2 hours in the air over this time. And they said, this is just never going to be enough. And the result was that he died in a crash. Then along comes Samuel Pierpont Langley. He's head of the Smithsonian Institution, which at the time was an actual research institution. And he built a big airplane, which he launched a great fanfare with all of the dignitaries there and all of the bunting straight into the Potomac. And the pilot, who I'm imagining must have been told that he's going to go down in history as the first man to fly an airplane, to Langley's great embarrassment, was cursing like a sailor in the middle of the river. And Langley spent $1 million in today's dollars on this fiasco. And it seems that he had done very little testing in advance. Then along come the Wright brothers, and they head down to Kitty Hawk. And the reason they went there is because instead of jumping off a cliff and going to the wind, they said, well, let the wind come to us. Then we can just stand still. We can just stand there and hold this craft, and we can spend a lot of time and safely and begin to investigate how to fly. Then in 1901, they had managed to get the first manned glider. And then 1902, they actually achieved controlled flight. And the key here is that you can see in this picture that there was no motor, that they'd figured out how to fly without the motor, so that wasn't the answer. So everybody knew how to fly. Everybody knew how wings worked. Everybody knew about lift, but everyone knew how to get into the air, but nobody knew how to stay there. So they'd achieved flight without the motor. Then in 1903, they put a motor on it, and then they could actually fly around, and they'd really learned to fly. And as the story goes, that they took their craft back to Dayton, and these two brothers flew around in a field without telling anybody about their great airplane for 2 weeks. I'm imagining these two boys grew up together, and they had made the world's greatest toy, this airplane that they could actually fly in. And then after 2 weeks, they finally told the world. And one of the things you can see in this picture is that only one of them is in the airplane. And this is not by accident, that they wanted to make sure that if one of them crashed and died, that the other one would be able to carry on the mission, because they knew they could do it, but they wanted to carry on the mission to fly. And somewhere about a decade or so later, both of them got in an airplane and flew together. And that was kind of their signal that they had done it, they'd achieved their mission. And they spent only about $40,000 in today's dollars on the whole thing, all of their airplanes, all of the travel to Kitty Hawk, $40,000, 25 times less than Langley had spent. And nobody died, and they achieved powered flight. So a little bit of perspective, this is a drawing from Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks over 400 years earlier. And it's quite striking that it looks an awful lot like Lilienthal's airplane. So very little progress, in a sense, had been made in 400 years. And then along come the Wright brothers, and they cracked the code of flight with really little more than Leonardo da Vinci had over 400 years earlier. It doesn't seem that Leonardo ever actually built anything. So we don't know what his methods were, and would he have cracked the code of flight or not. So the question is, do you want to be more like the Wright brothers or more like Langley? So strategy is what you do. It includes the people you work with, how you get money and how you spend it, management, all your planning and processes, and the facilities you have. Habits are how you do something. So like when you're going to cross a busy intersection, you look both ways, you look up at the light, and you do this every single time without even thinking about it. And this leads to great success in navigating busy intersections. So here's the first habit. So number one is the old method was why, and the Wright brothers switched to more of asking what rather than why. So you can imagine Langley sitting in his ivory tower, kind of ordaining how an airplane should fly, kind of this 19th century idea of the superiority of man over nature, that I will just create an airplane out of my own mind. So in that model, you think, and then you plan, and then you build, and of course, then you crash. In the new way, you observe, you do, and you test, and then you repeat this over and over again. In a sense, you're humbling yourself to nature rather than thinking you're superior to nature. You humble yourself and you let nature tell you the answer rather than trying to figure it out yourself. This is the whole key. When you ask what, you begin to just say, well, I'm just going to look at the world and I presume that the answer is out there. And if I could explore it long enough, then the answer will appear to me rather than me having to be a genius and figure it out. It will sort of unfold magically before you, as it did to them. There was a moment when one of them was in the glider, Wilbur Orville, and he noticed something that was based on his observations that he was trying, but he noticed this little thing, and he began to, this little insight sort of came to him just by seeing what was happening rather than sitting in his office, and then they cracked the code of flight. Number 2, answer questions fast. The motto here is don't launch the space shuttle to test the door seals. That you want to figure out a way that you can quickly answer questions and unlock the pipeline to data. That presumably there's this big space you have to explore, and there's this whole pipeline of questions you want to ask and answers that are going to come to you, and how do you open that gateway? So before you, rather than saying, well, what are the things I need to figure out? What are the answers? The first question you want to ask is, what can I do to answer questions faster? So there are 3 things you need to do this. Number 1 is testbeds. Number 2 is testbeds. And number 3 is, of course, testbeds. So the Wright brothers, to do this, they built their famous wind tunnel. And they were able to test 1,000 wings, thousands of wings, fast and cheap. So they were just taking old saw blades and bending them into different shapes and making tables of lift and how the wings worked. And they could explore the space extremely fast and extremely completely. One of the things they discovered was that to lower the resistance of a wing going through the air, you might think that you'd want a sharp edge to go through the air. That would just slice through the air. It turns out that that's wrong. It turns out, and they discover this, that a curved edge of the leading edge of a wing moves through the air much more easily. And they didn't know why. And it wasn't until well into that century that someone figured out the answer, which has to do, it's very subtle, has to do with vortices that form on the surface of the wing and kind of act like ball bearings for the air moving over it. But they didn't need to know why. They just needed to see what was actually happening and what actually worked. And they didn't have to come up with it. They were able to just explore it, and the answer appeared before them. Here's an example from my own research. This is when I was developing a method of surgery using water jets for tissue resection. And this is the cutting head, and they're very small. It's about 3 millimeters across, and this water jet comes out of it. And these were very expensive and hard to make. They cost about $2,000 and took about 2 weeks each to make. And so just like the Wright brothers looking at Lilienthal, it was clear that this was never going to get us to the answer fast enough. So the idea was to build a test bed where we could look at actually how the water jets were formed, rather than, we couldn't actually see it work in the body, but we could see how the water jets worked. Let's see if this will play. So we were able to build these, we designed so we could build these pucks that we would install, and these discs that contained an aperture, an orifice. And then in under a minute, we could change it out and try a different idea. And these cost about $25 for each of the pucks we made. And our machinists could make about $5 of them a day. So you could move very, very fast. Along with this, you're going to come up against the question of the time-money triangle, that you can't get something for cheap, high quality, and fast all at the same time. You can't have all 3. And this is of course true in R&D, but it's true in everything else in life. But so you can't, if you want something cheap and fast, it's not going to be low quality. If you want something cheap and high quality, then you won't be able to get it. You'll have to give up time. It's going to take a long time to get that bargain. If you want something fast and high quality, well, that's going to cost you money. So the question is, in R&D, which do you do? Because you're going to face this every single day. And the answer is give up cost. You'll always win by getting something fast, spending the money, get it fast, and get it as high quality as you can to move forwards. And in the long run, you'll actually save money, and you'll be most effective. Number 3, don't make assumptions. You want to test everything and follow all paths. When the question arises, should I try A or B? The answer is yes. You have to try everything. You have to cover all your bases. And one of the things that many people don't notice in the pictures of the Wright brothers and their gliders, that there's always these 2 guys standing down here holding the airplane. And the earlier one I showed, they're holding the glider on ropes. And this allows them to have many, many hours in the air where the guy in the air or the people holding it can do lots and lots of tests, and they can answer all the questions they need to answer. Along with this is don't think you know the answer. Don't guess. Be aware and honest about what you don't know. That if your mind comes across something you don't know, then write it down and eventually answer it. On one project that I was on, we had a whiteboard in the conference room, and every time we came up with something, we just write it down on the board, like, I don't really know how this is going to work, or here's an area where I think this might fail. I'm not sure this is going to hold up. And you write it down, and by the time we got to surgery, we had checked off this huge list, and then it worked. Presume if you don't know if something will work, it won't. And don't brush things under the rug. You won't get away with it, as we know from this famous example. Number 4, build open test beds. Don't build what you can't see and poke. So you want to be able to get your hands into things. You want to be able to get your instruments in so you can see what's happening. If you build it in a way you can't see inside, you're never going to get anywhere. So this is an example from the surgery again, where this is these are water jets. These are as thin as a human hair, and instead of doing it inside the body, we look at the water jets on a bench top where we can get a microscope in there and a camera and a high-speed flash. Incidentally, this flash came from Edgerton's lab at MIT. They actually sell the original ones that Edgerton made. And so we began to learn things when we were observing this about how the water jets work. And so you can see this corkscrew here. I hope my cursor is working. In this middle image on the right side, there's a corkscrew. And you can see it again, this whole jet is corkscrewing. And this was an extremely important observation in understanding how these water jets work. So we're able to get in there and we observe what's happening. And once we observe this, then we knew how to control it. And once we knew how to control it, we could create the effects we want to create. And once you create that, then we could this leads to success. And this is now a machine that's available in the US in hospitals. So again, you observe, and then you can control, and then you can create, and then you can succeed. Number 5, don't be a perfectionist. You want to do just enough to move on. You want to create in yourself a sense of urgency, that you always just want to go, go, go. What can I do? Doing just enough so you can move forwards. You don't know how much of A you're going to have to do until you do a little bit of B, and then you get all the way to C, and then you go back and you say, okay, now I need to improve A, and then I can move forward to D. This is also known as duct tape is your friend, that if a piece of duct tape will hold it down, you're good to go, move on. This one really, I owe to my advisor, who I had spent a month working on a device that would move a little flap inside a vacuum chamber. And he did say to me, he said that you needed to do this as part of your education and spend all that time to do that. And I built all these electronics and fancy mechanisms. And he said, but look, and he took me by the hand and marched me up to Bell Labs, walked me into his lab, and showed me how he had done the same thing. And I peered inside the vacuum chamber, and I could see a plastic protractor, a paper clip, and a piece of Scotch tape. And it was still working after 10 years, and he'd never gone back to improve it. It had taken probably 5 minutes to make and never needed improvement. And this was the machine where he did his most famous work that led him to win the Buckley Prize. The motto for this is also, don't build a pyramid to change a light bulb. That it's certainly a stable way to get up to the light bulb, but it has the obvious cost and time associated with it. That a much better approach is to take a bunch of sticks and, of course, our friend some duct tape, and slap it all together, and very quickly you'll change the light bulb and you'll discover, oh, I need steps and I need this A-frame. And to an R&D engineer, this is a thing of beauty, because an R&D engineer would look at this and say, well, I can see where this is going. I can see this solves the problem. It's not a beautiful thing that you can use, but it's really solved the problem. And once you do that, then you can send it over to product development and manufacturing. And that's the time for perfection. That's the time to make something beautiful, not an R&D. Number 6, don't do anything that requires finesse. That means that you don't want to push the limits of materials, of machines, or of physics. That you want to find materials, machines, and physics and everything else that works within the realm of what those things were designed to do. Where's the easy spot of those things? No plan should include, and then a miracle occurs. So here's an example from this electron micrograph SEM photo of, it's a 2D MEMS gyroscope from these guys that came to Stanford, and they built one in a month, and they had finished it in 6 months, and in a year they'd sold it to Wii, and it was the sensor inside the Wii remote. And then it was the sensor inside the iPhone, and then it was in everything. And so they were able to lay out from the beginning to the end everything they were going to do from start to finish. And it was a lot of really hardcore engineering. It was not easy, but there were really very few unknowns in it. And this led to their success. So some of having no finesse and to be effective means, how do you pick a project? That if you have a choice of projects, then pick the ones that look like it's really doable, that it's not going to really push the limits of things. So my own story when I was at Stanford was, I was developing a transistor, and that transistor is now in the iPhone also, but it was so difficult to do that we really were struggling, because it was really pushing the limits to do a nanotechnology device with extreme materials challenges in the Stanford clean room. Really just wasn't ever going to work. And it seems that I hadn't learned this lesson yet. And it seems that nature and I think business abhors a vacuum. And so Samsung stepped in and they picked up the technology without our permission, but they put, to our estimate, maybe $250 million into it, and they made it work, and now it's in the iPhone. And so now we're suing them, but the better example of the InvenSense guys who made the sensor, my buddy from Stanford, he lives on an island off of Seattle. So which would you rather do? Along with this is, you can think about it as never walk a tightrope, that requires so much skill, and it requires all of the stars to line up, and all of the whole environment has to be just perfect for you to do it. Whereas a much better plan is to use your ingenuity to come up with a more robust solution. That it's kind of the easy way out to say, well, we'll just put a wire across it and we'll figure out how to make it. We can do it. We're tough guys and gals, and we're just very good at this, and we'll just make it work. But that's really not a good plan for success. Use your mind and your ingenuity and the way you explore the space to create something much more solid. Number 7, dream big. The idea here is that, excuse me. The idea is that when you're trying to solve something, rather than saying, we're over here and we want to go over there, but we're over here, so we don't know how to get over there because I'm here and I can only take a step. The next step from here, I don't know where to go. The better way is to say, well, where do I want to go? And just put that as a stake in the ground. And the magic of engineering is that solutions arise to make that dream a reality. Engineers are great at saying, you say, well, look, we have to cross the canyon over here. And they say, no, we can't do that because we only know how to cross the canyon over there. And you're like, nope, we got to cross the canyon over here. And they go away, and in 2 weeks they go, okay, we figured it out. Here's how you do it. I came across this at a solar company I was at in California, where these huge sheets of solar cells, and the machines were inspect them, were picking them up by the front, and that was causing defects. And we had no idea how to pick them up by the back. The way they came through machines, it seemed the only way is to pick them up by the front. It's like, no, we just don't know how to do that. There's no way to do it. But we said, look, here's what we want our machine to do. And one of the things we wrote down was it has to pick them up by other than the front. They can't touch the front. And it took about a couple of weeks. And sure enough, a solution emerged and we figured out a way to pick them up from the back. So here's all of them. Number one, again, ask what, not why. Number two, answer questions fast. Number three, don't make assumptions. Number four, don't build what you can't see and poke. Number five, don't be a perfectionist. Number seven, no finesse. Don't do anything that requires finesse. And number seven, dream big. And number eight, do email me at cosmo@gruppworks.com. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Cosmo. That was awesome. That was really, really fun and informative. I loved your presentation and your slides. So we have time to take questions from the audience. And while we're waiting for those to come through in the chat, I'm going to put up a quick poll survey to get feedback on this program, as we do at the end of all of our programs. So if you wouldn't mind filling out the poll, it is anonymous. And if you have any questions for Cosmo, please put them in the chat. I loved this presentation because there were some real nice nuggets, takeaways. I liked your dice with the time, quality, and money, and that you really can't have all three. I thought that was a really important bit of information, and interestingly enough, to give up on the cost piece of it so that the other two can be achieved. I like that a lot.
Yeah, and in life, we always come across that one. And in life, you may want to make a different choice. And actually, in general, in life, that triangle is useful because if you don't actually notice that you're facing that choice and you don't consciously decide, then you mess up. It's a lot of projects stall, or anything you work in life stalls. But if you notice, the reason it's stalling is because we're trying to do all three, and you can't. And that's a good management tool to say, okay, look, this is happening, guys. Let's pick.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I'm going to close up the poll. It looks like almost everyone has voted. And if you haven't yet, do it. I'm going to close it in just a few seconds. Okay, great, thank you. Meanwhile, we do have some questions. Julie Toplin, you feel free to open your mic if you'd like. She asked, is there any advice on convincing management to pay the dollars to get the fast and awesome from the triangle?
That's actually a really interesting point. So every time you do this, and that money actually usually relates to making a test bed, is when that comes up the most. You say, look, so like when we did the surgical one, we actually had to stop doing anything for 2 weeks, that no results came out for several weeks while we retooled and said, look, we're going to build this. And so you have to have the complete story. You have to justify why is this going to work. And what you can say is, well, the reason I need the money is because I'm going to unlock this pipeline of data. And if we slow down and spend the money, then all the data is going to come flowing. And in the end, your cost is going to be lower because we'll actually get to the answer. That's the overall thing, that if you'll get to the answer. So if you spin for years, you'll never get there. There was a project at the solar company where all the solar cells were failing with what we called the blotch problem. And they were doing exactly what Langley did. I'd go into these meetings and they would sit there, what could be happening? And why is this happening? And they would ordain, we think it's this. And then 40 people would rush out for 3 days and try and solve it. And it turns out, it wasn't that. They're just guessing. And finally, my team said, we're going to fix this. And we solved it in 2 weeks. And we just started to ask what, and we're actually physically pulling the solar cells apart and trying to see what is actually inside there. It's a very small system. So if you can get in there and see what is it, and we eventually figured it out and walked into a meeting and showed this little video of these bubbles, and everyone like, oh my God, there's the smoking gun. So the answer to the question is really, you're going to save money because you're going to get to an answer. If you don't spend the money, you're not going to get to an answer. So in the long run, you're not actually spending more money because you're going to get to an answer sooner.
Okay, that's good. That makes sense. Great. So the next question is from Josh Fetterspiel. He asks, how do you cancel a project based on its feasibility within your manufacturing ability or knowledge base if it's technically difficult, but you don't know what else is available?
That's a long question, Josh.
Josh, you can open your, do you have your
Okay,
mic open?
I'm open there. Hi.
So how do you cancel a project? I mean, I guess is your question really when and how do you know that you should cancel a project?
Well, it's like, I don't know, I've sat in design reviews where we discuss, you know, complexity of medical products. We have a list of 12 things, and which ones are most relevant and most fit within our scope of stuff. But there's one that's like really neat and has a market, but it's a little outside of what we normally do. And it kind of, you know, it got whacked because I was working at a company that's trying to do extremely fast lead times on complicated medical devices, and that was one that got cut because of that. So
that makes sense. I mean, I think maybe the answer is that they may have been right to cut it. If I hear you saying that it looked like it was going to be a long time to do, and they didn't have the time, and that may come under that. That may mean that they recognize that it was a project that had a lot of finesse in it, that it was just too much to do. And part of being successful, and I know the company worked at it, and it's a very successful company, and part of it is don't do something that requires finesse, and have that sense yourself that, wow, if I've got 2 projects to work on, let me do the one that I can actually do. Why do I have to pick the hardest one?
And that's a tough one as an engineer. You want that like really unique, like complex thing that just you solve simply. And I've had those successes. You've had those successes, and
well, I think the other part
decision. It's not an emotional thing. That's what I'm saying.
Well, I think part of the equation is that as engineers, we have to be aware of picking projects that are about our satisfaction, which is really about us, versus what actually will lead to an effective end goal. And that's where we have to get out of the way and say, I could do that project because I am just so tough and so cool that I could make that happen. But say, well, maybe not. Maybe that's finesse, and that would be great to solve. Then I'll feel like a hero. But you don't want to be a hero. You want to be a success.
Right. That's an awesome answer, man. Thank you. That summed it all up. Wow. Yeah. No, that's great. That's a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
So can I weigh in on that?
Sure.
So I'm not an engineer, and I'm enjoying this conversation, but I think it also goes to as not knowing what your company was working on, but on the business side, making sure as you're going through the evaluation process of your ideas and what moves forward and what doesn't, making sure that for each phase of that you have success criteria, you know, for that phase. Because then if you evaluate where you are on something against that criteria, it helps clarify whether or not at that point it's time to move on or time to take those learnings and, you know, put that aside for now. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't come back to it at some other point in time, but having what that success criteria is can be important as well.
I think that makes sense, Shannon. And I think the key test there is does the success criteria mean you're going to have to walk a tightrope? That if it looks like if people are getting the feeling like this isn't happening and we're matching it against our success criteria, does that mean that why isn't it happening? And it's probably that you're walking a tightrope, and that's not a good idea. And it's time to leave the project.
Right, and it doesn't also mean that you haven't learned something, because even if something doesn't move forward, very small number of ideas become a reality. The number escapes me at the moment, but it's very, very small. But if you can take those learnings to help inform something else that you're working on, whether it's now or down the road, that's important too.
Well, the other thing I would say in that regard is to look at, you look at something and say, this one's not hitting its success targets. Well, what's happening there? Is it the project, or is R&D not getting there for some reason? And these habits are a way to look at that project. You can take this framework and say, well, let's analyze the project in terms of these 7 habits. And what I've found is that very quickly, one of the 7 will pop up and you say, oh, we're not doing this one, and that's in our way, and that's why they're failing. And it doesn't mean the project is a bad project, but no one may have built a test bed, that the tests are too slow. And so you say, okay, we don't have to kill the project, but we have to retune our habits and then maybe give this project another chance.
Exactly.
I like to, not to belabor this, Cosmo, but there's difference in engineers too. Some of them quit after 3 or 4 prototypes. They're like, whatever, it's not going to work. I remember you've done this where you make 19, 20 prototypes and you finally get the one at the end that works. Everybody's just doubting and all this complaining, and you're like, no, in my heart, I know this thing is going to actually work when I thread it into here. And I don't know, I'm of the regard to continue until there's absolutely no solutions you haven't tried. Which
I absolutely agree with that. And I think the key is that once you have enough experience of doing this kind of process, that when you look at a project, you say, yeah, I'm going to do this, but you can estimate how long it's going to take. So you can talk to management and say, well, so here's the thing, you ask an engineer, and I've faced this many times, you say to an engineer, well, how long is this project going to take? And there's I don't know, we never built one of these. And well, let me see. Is it going to take 1 experiment? Oh, no. Well, is it going to take 1,000 experiments? Oh, no. Okay, so it looks like you do know something. So you're able to estimate then how many experiments is it going to take? And then you look at, and they said, well, this looks like it's kind of like a 100 experiment kind of project. Well, then let's figure out how long is it going to take to do these. And then you can actually come up with a plan and say, yeah, we have enough time for that. But you also have to say within that, well, are you doing it the right way? That if you're building something every 2 weeks, well, you're never going to get there. How can we do 10 experiments a day? And that's the goal. You have to do several experiments every single day. And if you're not doing that, then retune your skills, retune your management, or change your team, do something that you can get in alignment with doing these habits correctly, and then you'll move ahead faster. And then you might convince people that we're actually going to make it. If you say, well, I'm just going to go on and I need a couple more experiments, well, how do we know you're going to get there? Well, you're going to have to convince them by saying, look, this is how the world works. I've done this. This is how many experiments it's going to take. We're going to do them this fast, and there's no finesse involved. We know we believe it's possible. We just have to find a way. And this is why. And then they'll go, whoa, that's impressive. I get it. Okay, you've got 3 months.
Huh. That's a great, I've been in those talks and I did not have that in my back pocket. So that's a good, thank you. That's another good point for me. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is from Bethany. And Bethany, if you're in here, why don't you go ahead and open your microphone, because you've got a long question. She asks, so
Sure.
It seems that number 6 should include people in terms of not pushing physical limits. Bethany, you want to continue?
Sure. I was just thinking back to your comment about don't push the physics of the materials, the machines, and so on. And I think so often engineers, programmers, people that are doing the innovation for companies end up being the fodder that does get pushed beyond their physical limits. So, and I really enjoyed the last discussion too, because I think engineers, and I resemble that comment as well, Josh was making, is we want to just keep going and going and going until we have the answer, and we will like just kill ourselves, you know, to do that. And what I was hearing you say is that, you know, to be an innovator, you really have to rely on your humility and discernment. Is this about me, you know, and my need for task completion? Or is it about the mission of what I'm trying to do? And I just, you know, I'm curious about, have you run into issues of navigating that boundary when people are working in businesses that are there to make money? You know, the navigating that boundary between ethics and innovation is, you know, what's ethical in terms of burning people out versus getting to that solution.
Absolutely, Bethany. I think that's a great point, and I laugh because that's clearly one of my blind spots, that I work too hard, and I don't know, I certainly burn out, you know, my body, that I don't get to exercise when I do that, and it would be good to not do that. So I think you're quite right that we really should include in the list, like, don't find a way to do it, the projects where you're not going to require people to work 70, 80 hours a week. When we're doing the malaria project that I think I tracked, I never worked less than 60 hours a week for 2 years. And in pushing to one deadline, I actually tracked my hours with an app, that I worked 94 hours one week. And we got our machine. It had to be on an airplane heading to Kenya on a, you know, 9 a.m. on a Monday. And if it wasn't there, you know, they'd bought the Land Rover in Africa, and if it wasn't there, everything failed. And that was a little bit crazy. And so I think I should add that to my own personal list. You're right. Yeah. Try and pick projects where you don't have to work that hard. I'll probably never stop doing that, but as a manager, it'd be good to be aware that to back off on that one. So thank you.
Or that it's short bursts, but that isn't a sustainable long-term strategy.
For most people. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, thank you. Super fascinating. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the question. It's awesome.
Thanks, Bethany. Okay, the next question is from Greg. He says, really good presentation, Cosmo. Could you share some comments on marketing? When does testing and poking the marketplace come into play? And Greg, you can open up your microphone if you'd like.
Hi,
Yeah.
Cosmo.
Hi, Greg.
Hey, I'm here.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. Why don't you ask that in your own, in your speaking voice?
Oh, well, in my speaking voice, I just curious, like if or what your experience would be interacting with like the marketing side, or assessing, you know, when you're doing R&D for an innovation, there has to be a marketplace, and then does some of that interaction between the R&D and the marketing function modify or inform your R&D process? So just curious, maybe it's a separate call for 7 habits of marketing, but I'm always interested in how the R&D ties into a marketplace, and you know, what kind of impact the product might have.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. It sounds like you probably know more about that than I do. But absolutely, there's of course, in developing any product, there's a continual, you've got to be testing the market every time you can. And there's often not a lot of energy for it in the early stages of R&D. But yeah, get it to in front of the client or the customer as soon as you can, and as often as you can. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, great. The next question is from Peter Kaplan. Peter, do you want to open your mic? He's got a question about COVID vaccine development.
Sure, great. That's fun to hear your voice after a little while, Cosmo. I find, with some experience actually having hands-on things in projects, watching the news, sometimes I pull my hair out, seeing people make mistakes on some of the kinds of issues you're talking about. So I'd love to hear your commentary on the completely different, like old school, new school approaches to digging us back into a world where we can meet in person.
Well, under full disclosure, Peter and I, we actually studied for our qualifiers in graduate school together. So we've known each other. I hate to think how many decades it is. So I'm not sure, Peter, I actually get your question.
Oh, I'm just wondering if you might not be following it, but I kind of feel like we have a brand new technology that has all sorts of things that it needs, like cold supply chains and so forth for some vaccines. And we have a very old technology that needs almost nothing, but maybe it's not performing at the same level in the news. And, it seems obvious to me what we ought to be doing, but from an inventor's like get it done point of view, I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Well, it's hard when your back is against the wall in any project that you have to. So we made the malaria project work, and it was completely finesse, but I don't think any of us understood when it started how much finesse was going to be involved and how far we're going to have to go with it. So we made it a success, but that was really, really tough. And sometimes you have to give up on one of these habits, but because you have to, but you don't want to. So right now, the whole world is their back against the wall. And so if you have to make a cold chain work, that is going to be really tough. And the chance of success is small, but you kind of have to try it. You kind of have to do everything you can. So that almost comes under follow every path, that you're going to have to try that one, and you're going to have to try the other ones. But it's not what you choose to do, but sometimes you have to do it. Does that help?
Sure. So you would just go for everything, unload the stops, because we probably have budget for that.
That's right. So if you don't know which one is going to work, it's that same question. And this was kind of a running joke at the malaria company, that this engineer would come and say, should I try this one or that one? And I'd say yes. That because you've got to get there and you just don't know, you can't really guess if we're going to be able to do it or not. You can't really guess which is going to work. You just have to do them all. And if you have the resources, that's what you have to do.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. The next question is from Keith. He asks, how do you accomplish fast testing on complex systems with many subsystems that just to set them up can take significant time when you're developing a large and complex system?
Yes.
Keith?
Yes, that's a great question. It's the systems question. And the key is really that you're going to have to break it down into its parts. So this is the space shuttle model, that you don't want to launch the space shuttle to test the door seals. So of course there's a system interaction, right? And I think that's what you're asking about is, well, you can't necessarily test the whole thing. You can't know the answers to everything until you actually build the system. But mostly that's not going to be true. Mostly that a system, the functionality of a system is dominated by a few key parts. And you have to make sure those key parts work. And the other is just engineering. You know it's kind of going to work if these parts really functioned as they say it will, that there's no finesse and it's just straightforward. If I had component A and subsystem B and subsystem C doing the spec that they're supposed to do, then I'm pretty sure the whole thing will work. So I hope this is possible in what you're talking about. Maybe you can say more, but I've faced this over and over again, that the idea is that you have to break it into its parts. And so build a huge setup to test the door seal. So the door seal team, when you need a door seal, that team shows up, they've done it, they know it works. You don't have to worry about it. You can kind of check that off in your system. You don't have to build the whole system to check that component. Does that fit with what you're working on and what you faced?
Yeah, this is Keith. So I'm currently working in an aviation company. So we have some large, complicated systems that have multiple subsystems, each of which are complex. And we do like board testing, mechanical thermal testing. So we do individual tests on each subsystem, build up our understanding and our verification. But ultimately, the systems that we work on require a validation, and it's a validation of the system. And so we have to get to that. So, I totally subscribe to the, test often, fail fast, keep going, work through design. But when you get to the validation step, it's difficult to do fast testing, because just to even set up the test takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of resources, and then to run the test can take days and thousands of dollars. So that's where the fail early, test fast excuse me, just kind of breaks down for me, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think you kind of know the answer, and the answer is that yes, that system test takes a long time. Launching the space shuttle takes a long time to really know that the thing is going to work. But you've got to make sure it's really going to work. And how do you know it's really going to work? Because you only get to do that test once. If it takes you weeks and thousands of dollars, you're only going to get to try it a couple times a year, probably. So you want to know 100% it's going to work. So have you looked at, are you completely honest about everything that you don't know? Are people say, kind of hoping, well, I don't really know if that's going to work, and I'll find out once I get it in the system? Has everyone, just like anytime someone says, boy, I don't really think you know that. And this can be brutal in engineering. You say it in, you have to be so honest, and you say it in engineering, you got to call them in the carpet and say, look, I really don't think you know that that's true. And you hope that there's no ego in the room, and that everyone gets that we're going to figure this out together. And then you create a culture where everyone says, I don't really know that. Okay, we write it down. There's a whole subsystem we have to test. We had a fiber going through into a high pressure volume, an optical fiber, and there's this little hair going through. And someone said, I don't really know that seal is going to hold. And so we had to actually build a whole setup to test that seal, so that we weren't going to build the whole system and get into surgery and the thing pops out. You're like, uh-oh, we kind of had that thought, but we didn't test it. So if you have the thought, then you test it. And then I would guarantee you that in the whole system, once you put it together, it's going to be, there's so little you don't know. You just believe at that point, well, it's going to succeed because we've tested everything.
Okay. Thank you. Great presentation.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you, Keith. The next question is from Bruce. He is asking, some worthwhile goals are never pursued, or they're delayed for many years because they're seen as too hard or too expensive. How does one circumvent this low-hanging fruit barrier?
That's really interesting. So you're saying that some projects, it looks like a great project, but the perception is that it's too hard. So the question is it too hard, or is it a perception it's too hard? So many people would have looked at the problem of controlled flight as, well, that's just too hard. We shouldn't do that, right?
I'd argue that most people, when the Wright brothers were alive, would have taken that point of view.
I agree with that, yeah. And they would have said, it's crazy. You guys are bicycle mechanics. What are you talking about? You're never going to solve that. Langley spent millions. This takes millions. It's too hard and too big. And so then I think what I would do is I would look at that problem and say, well, I would analyze it in terms of, how many experiments is it going to take? Can I break it down? Can I build test beds? Where is the finesse in this project? I would look at it with all of these habits and And if I look at it that framework, then I might say, huh, it really is a doable project because I now know how, and I've proven that I know how to attack something and make it work. And if you look at it and say, yeah, well, this is going to take 10,000 experiments, and we don't have the money for that, and we don't have the runway for that, then maybe it is too big. But sometimes it's too big because people don't actually know, the people that are making the decision don't actually know how to do R&D, or they've done R&D in ways that was just too expensive and they never got anywhere.
People often, if you look at the statistics, okay, just take something like biotech, for example, and you look at what gets funded and what doesn't, very frequently, business people who want to invest somehow and then get their money back will give you a certain window of time to achieve it. And those habits of filtering for projects that can give you a return on investment within that window will screen out many things that really would be valuable and in all probability are achievable, but will never get seriously looked at because of the mechanisms that we have for allocating effort to these goals. And I see that as self-defeating in some ways. I mean,
Well,
if you
that's
never
fair. That's totally fair. But if you show up and you're the one selling it, and you say, "Look, I've done this. I know how to do this. This is not a big project," then you say, "Look, I've done it. I can show how I've done it." You have to, each person in any project can show up and build up their own credibility and say, "I know how to do this. I can show you that this is not really that big a project."
right. Yeah.
And biotech is a great example. It's one of the best examples of how they realize that experimentation in the space is so hard that they've developed methods to unclog the pipeline to data with these, like the plates that have 1,000 wells in them, and a robot that goes along and puts something in each of them. And so it's a fantastic example of saying, well, it kind of looked like finesse because it's just too hard and they got to do too many experiments. But then said, well, we have to unclog the pipeline to data and build these machines where we can ask thousands and thousands of questions, and then we can do drug experimentation very quickly.
Here's an example of something that happened in the early 2000s. There was an effort that was pretty much industry-wide to develop what was called combinatorial chemistry. So they did chemistries that were easy and could be done serially. So you could build molecular structures out of common elements in mass. You could produce a library with 200,000 compounds in it fairly efficiently. But when they started screening these libraries, and everybody did it, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes that much per company on this. They discovered that the molecules that they were able to make were not drug-like. And, they'd hit targets, but they'd hit lots of targets. They couldn't, focus in on one receptor or something of that kind by this approach because the molecules just were they were easy to make, and easy to screen, but they were not high success rate structures. And so all of this equipment, these laboratories, buildings were built to hold these things, just completely were abandoned and just are sitting around to this day, all shiny stainless steel, nothing happening. Wow. Because at some level, people wanted to take a combine out in the low-hanging fruit field and just mow the whole thing. And it turned out there was nothing there ultimately. It looked like an easy thing to do on a large scale. And when you went back and looked at the result, it was a complete waste. And that should have been foreseeable. If someone had really thought about, Jesus, is this likely to produce anything? And you look at the molecules that they were making, it's like, these don't look like any existing drugs at all. There was no structural resemblance. A medicinal chemist would never try to make anything like that. But they had diverged based on this low-hanging fruit habit that they developed. And the whole industry went down that road because somebody was afraid of being left behind.
Well, it sounds like there was a belief that there was something there, and there really wasn't a there. That's kind of
right. Right. It wasn't founded on anything except this habit of going after low-hanging fruit. You know, the business side of the industry, which was
I would
funding.
say you need a proof of an existence proof. Like, how do you believe that something is there? So if you take flight, of course, everybody knew flight has to be possible because birds do it. So it had to be possible, but we're going to have to figure out what they do, and then we can do it. So there has to be something that's beyond that drives you to believe, well, I really think this ought to be possible. Like, what makes you think it ought to be possible in the projects you pick?
Okay,
Well,
thank you. Good talk.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. We are about out of time, and I just wanted to thank you, Cosmo, again. This was really fun, really enjoyable, and really, truly informative. And you can tell by the questions that you got and a lot of interest. So thank you so much for putting this together.
Well, thank you so much. That I would love if anyone wants to reach out. That one of the things I really enjoyed is working with people. Like, I worked with the biodesign program at OHSU, and they would present their projects, and it became very clear pretty quickly which one of the 7 habits they weren't doing, and we helped talk them through that one, and the lights would go on, and suddenly the project would be going downstream again. So if anyone just wants to talk something over, I'd be happy to do that.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So as a reminder, I did record this program, and I will be sending out the recording tomorrow, along with a PDF copy of the slides. And it has Cosmo's email address on the slide, so you can reach out to him if you'd like to have any more information or ask any other questions. All right, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Cosmo. Thank you, everyone, for participating and supporting the OBI, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.